You know that specific sound a human shin makes when it connects, at high velocity, with the solid steel rim of a heavy-duty municipal garbage bin? It's not a thud. It's not a clang. It's a wet, bone-shuddering crunch that reverberates all the way up your spine, bypasses your brain, and rings a bell directly in your soul that screams, "You are dying." That was the sound that echoed through the pitch-black void of Oak Haven Estates at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. I didn't scream immediately. There was that 3-second delay where your nervous system is just filing the paperwork for the pain. I was lying on the cold asphalt of my driveway, clutching my leg, rolling back and forth like a glistening rotisserie chicken, trying to breathe through my teeth. My golden retriever, Barnaby, who is usually a source of comfort but is currently functionally blind in the dark, decided this was playtime. He planted a paw directly into my solar plexus and licked my forehead. "Get off." "Barnaby!" I wheezed, pushing him away. I sat up, blinking, trying to let my eyes adjust. But they didn't adjust. They couldn't adjust. There was nothing to adjust to. I held my hand up 6 inches from my face. Nothing. I looked toward the street, where the sidewalk should be. Nothing. It was like being inside a sensory deprivation tank, except the tank smelled like suburban trash juice and wet dog. This wasn't a power outage. If I turned my head 180 degrees, I could see my own front porch light, a weak yellow bulb that barely illuminated the doormat. But the street? The cul-de-sac? It was a black hole, a void, a yawning abyss where light went to die. And it was all because of Richard. I managed to stand up, testing my weight on my left leg. It throbbed, a deep, angry pulse that synced up with the pounding in my temples. I limped toward the curb, squinting into the darkness. I knew exactly where the streetlight was supposed to be. It was a tall, majestic, wrought iron imitation Victorian post directly between my property line and the Hendersons'. It had been dark for 6 months. 6 months. I wasn't the only one. The entire block was out. 12 houses, plunged into the kind of darkness that usually precedes a jump scare in a horror movie. 6 months, I muttered to the darkness. Barnaby sneezed in agreement. I limped back inside, grabbed a bag of frozen peas from the freezer, slapped it onto my swelling shin, and sat at my kitchen island. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I'm a patient man. I'm a retired logistics engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. My entire career was built on solving complex problems with limited resources in hostile environments. I've built bridges over rivers while people were shooting at me. I've routed supply lines through monsoons. I can handle a lot. But I cannot handle Richard, the president of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association, telling me that changing a light bulb requires a fiscal feasibility study. I looked at the clock. 2:30 a.m. Too early to call. Or was it? No, I needed to wait. I needed to be rational. I needed to document this. I grabbed my phone and opened the HOA community app, Neighborly. I scrolled past the posts about lost cats and complaints about people leaving their bins out for 12 minutes past the pickup window. I found the thread I had started 4 weeks ago. Subject: Streetlights out on Elm and Oak. Status: pending review. Comments: 0. Pending review. For a month. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, icing my leg, staring out the window at the wall of black ink that was my front yard, plotting. When the sun finally dragged itself up over the horizon, revealing the perfectly manicured, soulless lawns of our subdivision, I was ready. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to follow the process. I was going to be the model citizen. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, I dialed the number for the HOA management office. It rang 4 times before a breathless voice answered. Oakhaven HOA, this is Janice. How can I make your day spectacular? Hi, Janice, I said, keeping my voice smooth, like butter over gravel. This is Jack Miller at 404 Elm. I'm calling about the streetlights again. I heard a heavy sigh on the other end, the kind of sigh that involves full-body deflation. Oh, hi, Mr. Miller. Right, the lights. Yes, the lights, I said. I tripped taking my trash out last night. Pretty sure I have a bone bruise the size of a dinner plate. It's very dark out here, Janice. Dangerous. I know, Janice whispered, as if she was afraid of being wiretapped. I put the work order on Richard's desk 3 times, Mr. Miller. He keeps moving it. Moving it where, Janice? To the bottom of the pile. He says we're in a budgetary recalibration period due to the clubhouse renovations. The clubhouse. Of course. The Oakhaven Clubhouse, a building that 90% of the residents didn't have a key to because the fob system was always broken, was currently undergoing a renovation that rivaled the construction of the pyramids. Let me speak to him, Janice. He's in a meeting. Janice, I can see his house from my kitchen window. He's currently leaf-blowing his driveway. He's wearing that Argyle sweater vest. Put him on. There was a pause, some fumbling, and the distinct sound of a hand being placed over the receiver. Then, the voice of God. If God was a 55-year-old man who peaked in high school debate club and drove a pristine white Lexus, came on the line. Jack, Richard boomed. Good morning. Beautiful day in the neighborhood, isn't it? I saw your hydrangeas are coming in nicely. A little wilting on the left side, maybe check your sprinkler heads, but otherwise, solid effort. The lights, Richard, I said, cutting through the pleasantries. Ah, the lights. The eternal struggle against the dying of the light, as Dylan Thomas would say. He chuckled at his own wit. I squeezed my phone so hard the case creaked. I almost broke my leg last night, Richard. It's pitch black. It's a safety hazard. We pay $350 a month in HOA fees. That is $4,200 a year. Per house. There are 200 houses in this development. That is nearly $1 million a year in revenue. Where is the money, Richard? Why can't we afford light bulbs? Whoa, slow down there, Jack, Richard said, his tone shifting from friendly neighbor to condescending guidance counselor. It's not just light bulbs, it's infrastructure. The underground wiring on Elm is old. We need a contractor to dig it up, reassess the conduit integrity, and ensure we're code compliant. We got a quote. It's substantial. How substantial? Let's just say it. Would require a special assessment. And nobody wants that, do they? Nobody wants an extra bill right before the holidays. It's July, Richard. The holidays creep up on you, Jack? Look, we prioritized the clubhouse pool tiles because that's a community asset that increases property value. Heated, imported Italian slate. It's magnificent. You really should come see it. I don't swim, Richard. I walk, at night. And I'd like to do it without needing night vision goggles. Well, Richard said, and I could practically hear the smirk through the phone lines. Maybe you should buy a flashlight, or install some motion sensors on your garage. Personal responsibility, Jack. We can't expect the association to hold our hands every time the sun goes down. Silence. The line hummed with the electric tension of a man about to snap. Personal responsibility. He threw the phrase at me like a grenade. Me. A man who had organized logistics for disaster relief. Zones. A man who labeled his spice rack with a label maker. Are you refusing to fix the lights, Richard? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I'm not refusing, he said breezily. I'm deferring. We'll look at it again in Q4. Until then, grab a flashlight, buddy. Stay safe. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. "Grab a flashlight." I looked out the window. Richard was still there, meticulously blowing 3 individual leaves off his driveway, the king of his little castle. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea who he had just brushed off. I didn't do anything drastic immediately. I'm a strategist. I needed data. I needed leverage. That night, I conducted a survey. I walked the neighborhood with a high-powered camping lantern. I knocked on doors. Mrs. Gable at 402 was terrified. "I don't go out past 7 p.m. anymore," she told me, clutching her robe. "I heard noises last week. Probably just a raccoon, but in the dark. It sounded like a bear." Mr. Henderson at 406 was furious. "My daughter comes home from her nursing shift at midnight. She has to run from her car to the front door using her phone screen. It's ridiculous." I collected signatures. I took photos of the pitch-black streets using a long exposure setting on my camera that made it look like the surface of a dead planet. I built a dossier. 3 days later, the incident happened. It was a Thursday night. Humid, sticky. The air felt heavy. I was in my garage, tinkering with my truck, when I heard the scream. It wasn't a scary movie scream. It was a scream of genuine pain and shock. I dropped my wrench and sprinted down the driveway. "Hello? Is someone there?" I shouted into the void. "Help! Oh dear God, help!" The voice was frail. I clicked on my tactical flashlight, the one Richard had so helpfully suggested I use, and swept the beam across the street. There, lying in the gutter across from my house, was Mrs. Higgins. She was 82 years old. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for the mailman and knit sweaters for the neighborhood squirrels. She was lying in a heap, her small poodle, Fifi, barking frantically in circles around her. I ran to her, kneeling on the asphalt. "Mrs. Higgins, it's Jack. Don't move. What happened?" She was clutching her hip, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't see," she gasped, her voice trembling with shock. "I thought I was on the sidewalk. I stepped off. I missed the curb. Oh, Jack, it hurts." "I'm calling 911, I said, pulling out my phone. The next 20 minutes were a blur of flashing red and blue lights, ironically the best lighting the street had seen in half a year. The paramedics loaded Mrs. Higgins onto a stretcher. The EMT, a guy I knew named Steve, looked at me and shook his head. "Second one this week on this block, Jack," Steve said, slamming the ambulance doors. "It's like a cave out here. Someone's gonna get killed." I watched the ambulance drive away, the siren wailing into the night. I stood there in the middle of the street, the red taillights fading into the darkness. Then I saw him. Richard. He had come out onto his porch, drawn by the commotion. He was wearing a silk robe. He stood there, hands on his hips, watching the ambulance leave. He didn't come down. He didn't ask if Mrs. Higgins was okay. He just watched, looking annoyed that the siren had likely interrupted his beauty sleep. He caught me looking at him in the beam of my flashlight. He gave a little half-wave, a sort of crazy night, huh? gesture, and then turned around, walked back inside, and shut his door. The lights in his house went out. I stood there in the dark, alone with the mosquitoes and the rage. The image of Mrs. Higgins crying in the gutter burned into my retinas. The sound of Richard's dismissal by a flashlight played on a loop in my brain. He wanted personal responsibility? Fine. He wanted me to solve my own lighting problems? Fine. He thought the budget was too tight for streetlights? Wait until he saw my budget. I walked back into my house, but I didn't go to bed. I went to my study, I opened my laptop and pulled up the Oak Haven HOA covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CCNRs. I've read government contracts that were less dense than this document, but I know how to find loopholes. I poured a black coffee and started reading. Section 4.2. Exterior Lighting. No permanent lighting fixtures may be attached to the exterior structure of the home that exceed 2,000 lumens without board approval. Okay, attached to the structure. Got it. Section 4.5. Nuisance. No activity shall be carried on upon any lot which may be or may become an annoyance or nuisance to the neighborhood. Vague, subjective, defensible in court. Section 8.1. Historical Preservation. The association encourages the display of historically significant artifacts and educational displays, provided they are maintained in good condition. I paused. I reread that sentence, historically significant artifacts. I leaned back in my chair, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. I remembered a place about 2 hours west of here, a military surplus scrapyard run by a guy named Sarge, who thought the government was run by lizard people and sold things that civilians probably shouldn't own. I didn't need a light bulb. I needed a statement. I typed into the search bar, General Electric, 1942, anti-aircraft searchlight specs. The results populated. Diameter, 60 inches. Candle power, 800 million. Range, 5.6 miles. Power source, 15 kilowatt DC. Generator, original purpose, spotting Nazi bombers at 20,000 feet. I looked at the map. Richard's bedroom window was exactly 340 feet from the edge of my driveway. If I positioned it correctly, if I angled the beam just right, I wouldn't just be lighting up the street. I would be simulating a divine intervention. I grabbed my credit card. Okay, Richard, I whispered to the empty room. Let's see how you like a little illumination. I closed the laptop. The plan was formed. The objective was clear. Phase 1 was complete. Now, I just had to go shopping. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the newly renovated clubhouse, a building that smelled aggressively of lavender and wasted money. The new Italian slate tiles that Richard had bragged about were indeed there, sleek, gray, and completely slippery. I watched Mrs. Gable almost wipe out near the snack table before steadying herself on a ficus plant. The room was packed. Usually these meetings were attended by 3 people: Richard, the treasurer, a nervous woman named Brenda, who looked like she was being held hostage, and Old Man Jenkins, who only came for the free cookies. But tonight, the room was buzzing. The word about Mrs. Higgins had spread. The darkness was no longer an inconvenience. It was a threat. I sat in the back row, holding a manila folder. I wasn't there to yell. I was there to offer one last chance for peace. I was the diplomat before the invasion. Richard sat at the head table, flanked by the board members. He looked like a king holding court. He banged a tiny wooden gavel that looked like it came from a toddler's play set. "Order! Order in the court," he chuckled. "Welcome everyone to the July meeting of the Oak Haven Estates Board. Exciting things on the agenda today. We have the Fall Pumpkin Festival Planning Committee to form, and we need to discuss the unauthorized planting of marigolds at the entrance. Looking at you, the Johnsons." He pointed a finger at a young couple who looked terrified. "Richard," a voice called out from the second row. It was Mike, a burly guy who drove a plumbing van. "Can we skip the marigolds? We need to talk about the lights." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "Yeah, the lights. It's dangerous. Mrs. Higgins is in rehab for a broken hip." Richard sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. It was a practiced gesture, designed to make us feel like unruly children. "People, please," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I sent out an email blast about this. We are aware of the situation on Elm and Oak, but as I explained to Jack the other day, infrastructure takes time. And money. Unless one of you wants to write a check for $50,000 right now, we have to wait for the reserve study in October. I stood up. The room went quiet. I didn't shout. I didn't wave my arms. I just walked to the front of the room, my boots clicking rhythmically on the overpriced slate. "Jack," Richard said, smiling tightly. "I see you made it. Did you bring a flashlight?" A few sycophants in the front row giggled. "I did," I said, placing the manila folder on the table in front of him. "But I also brought a solution." "A solution?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Are you an electrical contractor now, Jack?" "No, I'm a logistics expert. And I've done the math. You say it's 50 grand to fix the underground wiring. Fine. I propose a temporary measure. We rent industrial floodlights, construction grade, diesel-powered. We place 3 of them on the street. Total cost, $2,000 a month. We can cover it by delaying the purchase of the new pool furniture." The crowd murmured approval. "That sounds reasonable?" "Yeah, why not?" Richard's smile vanished. He hated being solved. He hated logic. Logic didn't come with a kickback or a power trip. "Absolutely not," Richard snapped. "Diesel generators? The noise? The fumes? It would violate the nuisance clause. It would be unsightly. We have an image to maintain here, Jack. We are a premier community, not a construction site." "Mrs. Higgins is in the hospital, Richard," I said, my voice hard. "Safety takes precedence over aesthetics." "Mrs. Higgins should have been more careful," Richard said. The room gasped. Even Brenda, the treasurer, looked shocked. Richard realized he'd slipped. He quickly backpedaled. "I mean, it's tragic, obviously. Terrible. But we can't govern based on accidents. We govern based on rules. And the rules say no temporary industrial equipment on the streets. Motion denied." He banged the tiny gavel. "Next item. The marigolds." I didn't move. I stared at him. "So, to be clear, Richard, you are refusing to provide lighting. You are refusing a temporary fix. And you are telling us that we are on our own for security and visibility? I'm telling you to trust the process, Jack. And stop being dramatic. If you're so scared of the dark, secure your own property. Light up your own yard. Just don't ask the HOA to pay for it." He leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "And make sure whatever you do is compliant. I'll be watching." I smiled. It was a genuine smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been given exactly what he needed. Permission. "Don't worry, Richard," I said, picking up my folder. "I'm a stickler for the rules. I'll make sure my solution is historically accurate." I turned and walked out. "Where are you going?" Mike the plumber whispered as I passed him. "Shopping," I said. I walked out of the clubhouse and into the humid night. I looked at the dark street. I looked at Richard's house, glowing warmly with its functioning porch lights and landscape uplighting. He wanted me to light up my own yard. He wanted me to take personal responsibility. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had saved earlier. "Sarge's Surplus and Scrapyard," a gravelly voice answered. "We got gas masks, ammo cans, and stuff the FDA says ain't safe. What do you need?" "Sarge," I said. "You know that 60-inch GE Searchlight you have listed on the website? The one on the trailer?" "The 42? Sarge laughed. Sounded like a chainsaw starting up. "Yeah, I got it. But that ain't a toy, buddy. That's a portable sun. You trying to signal Batman?" "No," I said, unlocking my truck. "I'm trying to signal a dictator." "I like your style. When do you want it?" Tomorrow morning. And Sarge, do you have the generator that goes with it? Does a bear crap in the woods? It's loud as hell, though. Perfect, I said. I'll see you at 0800. I hung up. I looked back at the clubhouse. Richard was still talking about marigolds. Enjoy the darkness while it lasts, Richard. Because tomorrow, the sun comes out at night, and it's going to be pointing right at your face. The drive to Sarge's scrapyard was a 2-hour journey that took me out of the manicured hellscape of suburbia, through the rolling farmlands, and eventually onto a dirt road that didn't appear on GPS. The sign at the turnoff was hand-painted on a piece of plywood that had been blasted with birdshot. Sarge's surplus, if you can. Read this. You're in range. I pulled my truck, a heavy-duty pickup that usually hauled nothing heavier than mulch, up to the main gate. The place looked less like a store and more like where the Transformers went to die. There were mountains of rusted metal, stacks of olive-drab crates, and what appeared to be the fuselage of a helicopter serving as a chicken coop. A man stepped out of a corrugated steel shack. This was Sarge. He was about 5'5", shaped like a beer keg, and wearing camouflage pants that were from 3 different wars. He had a cigar clamped between his teeth that defied the laws of physics by not falling out when he spoke. "You the guy who called about the candle?" he barked. "The Searchlight," I corrected, stepping out of the truck. "Jack?" "Sarge," he grunted, shaking my hand with a grip that could crush walnuts. "Follow me. She's out back. Kept her tarped. Birds like to nest in the mirror. Turns them into crispy critters if you fire it up without checking." We walked through a maze of industrial detritus. I stepped over a crate marked explosives, handle like eggs, and tried not to think about my life insurance policy. "So," Sarge said, navigating around a stack of tires. "What's the mission? Grand opening? Movie premiere? Alerting the mothership?" "Homeowners Association dispute," I said. Sarge stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, a grin spreading across his face that revealed a gold tooth. "HOA? You're buying a World War II anti-aircraft Searchlight for an HOA dispute?" "They won't fix the streetlights," I explained. "So I'm fixing the darkness." Sarge threw his head back and laughed. It was a terrifying sound, like a badger in a blender. "I love it. I hate HOAs. My brother-in-law got fined for having the wrong color mulch. Communist bastards. Come on, Jack. Let me introduce you to the General." We rounded a corner, and there it was. Even under the tarp, it was massive. Sarge whipped the canvas off with a flourish. It was breathtaking. It was terrifying. It was perfect. The General Electric 60-inch Searchlight. It sat on a 4-wheeled trailer that looked like it could survive a direct mortar hit. The drum itself was 5 feet across, painted a dull, menacing olive drab. The glass lens was thick, reinforced, and stared back at me like the eye of a mechanical cyclops. "Ain't she a beauty?" Sarge said, slapping the metal flank. 1942, fully restored. This isn't a light bulb, Jack. This is a carbon arc lamp. You know how that works? "Assume I don't," I said, walking around the beast. "Okay, simple version. You got 2 rods of carbon inside here." He pointed to the back of the drum. "Positive and negative. You run a massive amount of DC current through them. The tips touch, they pull apart, and you get an arc of plasma. It burns at about 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's brighter than the surface of the sun." 9,000 degrees, I repeated. "Will it melt vinyl siding?" "If you get it close enough, it'll melt the sins off a preacher," Sarge said. "It pulls 800 million candle power. For context, a lighthouse is maybe 1 million. You turn this on, and the International Space Station is going to wonder why the sun came up early in Pennsylvania." "It's perfect," I said. "Now the kicker," Sarge said, walking over to a second trailer. "Power. You can't plug this into your wall outlet. You'll blow the grid for the whole county. You need this." He patted a generator that was the size of a Honda Civic. "Hercules inline-6 gas engine," Sarge said lovingly. 15 kilowatts of direct current. It drinks gas like a sailor drinks rum, and it sounds like a tank battle. You cool with noise?" "The noise is a feature, not a bug," I said. "Good man." We spent the next hour going over the logistics. Sarge showed me how to feed the carbon rods. They were consumable, like giant pencil leads that burned away. "You got an automatic feed mechanism here," Sarge explained, his hands covered in grease as he fiddled with the internals. "Keeps the arc gap constant. If it jams, you gotta manually crank it. Do not look at the arc without welding glass. You will go blind. Instantly. I ain't liable for that. Sign here." He handed me a clipboard with a waiver that essentially said, "If I incinerate myself or my neighbors, it's my fault." I signed it with a flourish. "Now towing," Sarge said, eyeing my truck. "You got a pintle hook?" "A what?" Sarge sighed. "Civilian hitch won't work. This is military ring hitch. I got an adapter, $50. Sold. Hitching it up was an ordeal. The Searchlight trailer weighed about 2 tons. The generator weighed another ton. I had to tow the light, and Sarge agreed to deliver the generator on his flatbed for an extra $100. "One more thing," I said as we tightened the chains. "Is this legal?" Sarge spat his cigar onto the dirt. "It's a historical artifact, Jack. It's a piece of American history. You got a right to preserve history, don't you? Just tell them it's an educational display. Cops love that stuff. Just maybe don't aim it at any airplanes. The FAA has no sense of humor." "I'm aiming it at a bedroom window," I said. "Even better," Sarge grinned. "Keep the rod feed steady. If the arc starts hissing like a snake, adjust the trim. Good luck, soldier." I drove out of the scrapyard with 800 million candle power in my rearview mirror. The trailer bounced and rattled, a heavy metallic clunk-clunk that felt like the heartbeat of impending doom. I passed a few cars on the highway. People slowed down to stare. A kid in a minivan pressed his face against the glass, eyes wide. I gave him a thumbs up. I was bringing the sun to Oakhaven. Getting the equipment to my house was one thing. Setting it up without Richard having a coronary before I was ready was another. I arrived home at 2:00 p.m. The neighborhood was quiet. Most people were at work. Richard, however, was retired. His car was in the driveway. I backed the trailer into my side yard, behind the fence line, as quickly as possible. I threw a heavy camouflage tarp over it. Then Sarge arrived with the generator. We used a winch to drag it behind my shed. "Stealth mode," Sarge whispered, winking at me before driving off in a cloud of diesel smoke. Now I needed infrastructure. I couldn't just park this thing on the grass. It vibrated. It was heavy. If I turned it on while it was sitting on soft turf, it would sink into the earth and end up aiming at the sky. I needed a stable firing platform. I called Mike. Big Mike. Mike was a local contractor who I'd used to redo my patio. He was a man of few words and immense physical strength. He arrived the next morning in his dump truck. "Morning, Jack," Mike said, looking at the patch of lawn I had marked out with spray paint. "You want a slab here? 10 by 10? "Reinforced," I said. "Double rebar. High PSI concrete. I need it to hold vibrations." Mike scratched his chin. He looked at the tarped shape behind the shed. He looked at the tarped shape in the side yard. He looked at me. "You building a bunker?" "It's a landscaping feature," I said. "A historical monument." Mike shrugged. "Long as the check clears. I can pour it tomorrow, but I gotta tear up a section of the fence to get the mixer in." "Do it," I said. The next day was chaos. The sound of the concrete mixer was the first shot across the bow. It's a grinding, churning noise that carries. I was out in the yard, supervising the pour, when I saw the curtains twitch in the house down the street. 5 minutes later, the inevitable happened. Richard came walking up the sidewalk. He was wearing khaki shorts and a polo shirt tucked in so tight it looked painful. He was holding a clipboard, of course he was. "Jack!" he called out, his voice faux cheerful. "Doing some renovations?" I signaled Mike to keep pouring. "Just a little garden project, Richard. Spruce up the place." Richard stopped at the property line. He rose on his tiptoes, trying to see over the fence where the mixer was churning. "A concrete slab? That's a bit industrial for a garden project, isn't it? Did you submit an architectural review form?" "I reviewed the bylaws, Richard," I said, walking over to him, wiping concrete dust off my hands. "Section 5.3 allows for hardscaping under 150 square feet without board approval, provided it doesn't alter the drainage." Richard narrowed his eyes. He flipped through his clipboard. "Well, yes, technically. But what is it for? A hot tub? Because hot tubs require a separate liability waiver." "Not a hot tub," I said. "It's a display pad for a piece of vintage Americana. I'm becoming a collector." "A collector of what? Lawn gnomes?" "Memorabilia," I said vaguely. "Don't worry, Richard. It's going to be tasteful. Educational, even." Richard sniffed. He looked at the heavy-duty concrete Mike was pouring. "Well, make sure you clean up the sidewalk. I don't want any dust residue on the public walkways." "Wouldn't dream of it." He walked away, but he looked back 3 times. He knew I was up to something, but he couldn't figure out what requires a foundation thick enough to land a helicopter on. Once the concrete was set and cured, which took 2 agonizing days of watering it to prevent cracks, I called Sparky. Sparky's real name was Steve, but everyone called him Sparky because he had once blown his eyebrows off in a fuse box incident in '98. He was the best electrician in the county, mostly because he didn't ask questions. "Okay, Jack," Sparky said, opening his tool bag. "You said you need to ground a generator? What are we talking? A little Honda for camping?" I pulled the tarp off the Hercules engine. Sparky dropped his wire strippers. "Sweet mother of pearl," he whispered. "Jack, is that from a battleship?" "Anti-aircraft battalion," I said. "It produces 15 kilowatts of DC. I need you to run a heavy-gauge ground wire, and I need you to help me rig a connection cable from this beast to the light." Sparky walked around the generator, touching it gingerly. "This isn't a generator, Jack. This is an earthquake machine. You realize when you turn this on, every dog in a 3-mile radius is going to start howling?" "I'm counting on it." "And what are you powering? A rock concert?" I walked him to the side yard and unveiled the searchlight. Sparky just stared. He stared for a full minute. Then he started laughing. He laughed so hard he had to lean against the fence. "Oh, this is rich," he wheezed. This is beautiful. You're gonna light up the street because Richard won't?" "I'm going to light up Richard," I corrected. Sparky wiped a tear from his eye. Okay, I'm in. But we need thick copper, welding cable, double-aught gauge. If we use standard wire, this thing will melt it into spaghetti in 10 seconds. We spent the afternoon rigging it. It was hot, sweaty work. We had to drag the heavy cables through the grass, burying them in a shallow trench so nobody would trip. We positioned the searchlight on the new concrete pad. It fit perfectly. I locked the wheels. I greased the elevation gears. The weapon was emplaced. We were just finishing up the final connection, bolting the thick leads onto the carbon arc assembly, when I heard a car slow down. It was a sheriff's deputy. My heart skipped a beat. Had Richard called the cops already? I hadn't even turned it on yet. The cruiser rolled to a stop. The window rolled down. It was Deputy Miller. I knew him. He was a regular at the diner where I got my morning coffee. "Afternoon, Jack," Miller said, eyeing the massive olive-drab drum sitting in my yard. "Afternoon, Deputy," I said, trying to look casual while standing next to a weapon of war. "That's quite a piece of hardware," Miller said. "What is it, a cannon?" "Searchlight," I said. "World War II, General Electric, restoring it. It's a hobby." Miller nodded slowly. "A hobby, right. Richard called. Said you were building a missile silo in your backyard." I laughed. "Classic Richard. No missiles, Deputy, just a light. A big historical light. You know, for Veterans Day coming up. Wanted to make sure it works." "Veterans Day is in November, Jack. It's July." "Never too early to prepare," I said. "Gotta respect the troops." Miller looked at the light. He looked at Richard's house down the street. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He knew about the streetlights. Everyone knew. "Is it gonna be loud?" Miller asked. "The generator is a bit rumbly," I admitted, "but it's under the noise ordinance limit. I checked. 85 decibels at the property line." Miller tapped his steering wheel. "All right, just keep it safe, Jack, and maybe don't blind any pilots. Strictly ground-level illumination, Deputy." He drove off. I exhaled. "You have a permit for that lie?" Sparky asked, tightening the last nut. "It wasn't a lie," I said. "It is historical, and I am preparing." "Preparing for what?" I looked at the massive carbon rod I was sliding into the chamber. It was black, thick, and ready to channel the fury of the gods. "Operation Daylight Savings," I said. The sun was setting. The sky was turning a bruised purple. The streetlights, predictably, did not flicker on. The darkness began to pool in the cul-de-sac. I looked at Richard's house. He was in his living room watching TV. I could see the blue flicker of the screen. "Is it ready?" I asked Sparky. Sparky checked his voltmeter. He checked the fuel level in the generator. He looked at me with a grin that was equal parts excitement and terror. "She's hot, Jack. One pull on the crank, and you're live." I looked at my watch. 9:30 p.m. Fully dark. "Go home, Sparky," I said. "You don't want to be an accessory to this." "Are you kidding?" Sparky grabbed a lawn chair from my patio and set it up behind the shed, putting on a pair of sunglasses. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." I walked over to the generator. It smelled of gasoline and anticipation. I primed the engine. I grabbed the hand crank. This was it. The moment of truth. The moment where malicious compliance stopped being a concept and started being a photon beam. I took a deep breath, gripped the handle, and heaved. The Hercules engine didn't just start. It exploded into life. Chug, 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 roar! The ground shook. The sound was a deep, chest-thumping bass note that immediately shattered the suburban quiet. It sounded like a tank was idling in my flower bed. I ran to the searchlight. I checked the voltage gauge on the side. The needle climbed. 60 volts, 70 volts. Inside the drum, the automatic feed motor whirred. The carbon rods moved closer together. Bzzz-t, a spark. Then, ignition. It didn't come on gradually. It was instantaneous violence. A ball of pure white-hot plasma ignited between the rods. The hiss was deafening, a sound like 1,000 angry snakes. A beam of light, solid as a marble column, punched out of the lens. It shot across my yard, cut through the darkness, and hit the oak tree across the street. The tree didn't just light up, it glowed. I could see the veins in the leaves from 50 feet away. A squirrel fell out of the branches in sheer terror. "Holy!" Sparky yelled over the roar of the generator. I grabbed the traverse wheel. The gears were smooth, greased, and ready. I began to turn the drum. The beam swept across the street. It was like wielding a lightsaber the size of a bus. It illuminated the pothole that had claimed Mrs. Higgins. It lit up the uncollected trash cans. And then I brought it to bear on the target. I elevated the beam slightly. I traversed left. The circle of light, focused and intense, slid across Richard's siding, melting the shadows away. It hit the second floor. I made a final adjustment. The beam locked onto the master bedroom window. The glass flared brilliant white. It was brighter than noon. It was brighter than a nuclear test footage. I let go of the wheel. The beam held steady. Inside Richard's house, the blue light of the TV vanished, replaced by the unfiltered wrath of 1942. I put on my welding goggles, sat down on the grass next to the humming drum, and cracked open a beer. "Your move, Richard," I whispered. Then, the screaming started. There is bright, and then there is existential dread induced by photons. The beam hitting Richard's house didn't just illuminate it. It seemed to physically push the structure backward. You could practically hear the vinyl siding groaning under the thermal assault. The light was so intense that the air particles in its path were visible, dancing like microscopic diamonds in a wind tunnel. I sat in my lawn chair, the welding goggles tinting the world a sickly green, and watched the chaos unfold. First came the sound. It wasn't just screaming. It was the sound of a man who believes he is being abducted by a celestial entity. Gah! My eyes! What is happening? Richard's bedroom window, which usually emitted the soft, smug glow of a frantic news channel, was now a square of pure, blinding white. I saw shadows moving inside, frantic, jerky movements. It looked like a silent film of a man fighting a swarm of bees, projected onto the surface of the sun. Then, the neighbors started coming out. Front doors opened tentatively up and down the street. People stepped onto their porches, shielding their eyes. Is that the sun?" I heard Mrs. Gable ask from 2 doors down. "No, Mom," her son replied, his voice filled with awe. "I think Jack opened a portal." The beam was so focused, so coherent, that while Richard's house was experiencing a thermonuclear event, the rest of the street was merely basking in the ambient glow. It was actually quite pleasant. The spillover light illuminated the entire cul-de-sac with a soft twilight hue. For the first time in 6 months, you could see the sidewalk. Then, Richard emerged. He stumbled out his front door wearing a silk robe that was untied, revealing a pair of boxer shorts with little sailboats on them. He was clutching a pillow over his head like a helmet. "Who is doing this?" he shrieked, blindly stumbling down his front steps. "Turn it off! I'm blind! I can see my own! Skeleton!" He ran toward the source of the light. Me. But he couldn't actually look at me. The beam was coming from my yard, and looking directly into the lens of a 60-inch carbon arc searchlight is the optical equivalent of staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun. He had to approach me sideways, crab-walking with his hand shielding his face. I took a sip of my beer. The generator chugged along, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. "Jack!" Richard screamed, shielding his eyes as he stopped at the edge of my driveway. "Is that you? What in God's name is that noise? What is that light?" I leaned forward in my chair. "Evening, Richard. Just testing out the new security system." "Security system?" Richard yelled, his voice cracking. "It's burning my retinas through my eyelids. My bedroom is 120 degrees. You're melting my blinds." Personal responsibility, Richard, I shouted back over the roar of the Hercules engine. You told me to. Buy a flashlight. I did. This is the General Electric Model 1942. It's got a bit of a kick. Turn it off. That's an order. I am the president of the HOA. Sorry, can't hear you over the generator. I cupped my ear. It's a very safe, very secure light. No one is tripping on my property tonight. Richard looked around wildly. He saw the neighbors gathered on their lawns. He saw Mrs. Gable clapping her hands delightedly because she could finally see her hydrangeas at night. He saw Mike the plumber laughing so hard he was doubled over by his mailbox. "I'm calling the police!" Richard screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I'm calling the police, the fire department, the National Guard, and the Pope! You are going to jail, Jack! You are going to prison!" He turned and scrambled back toward his house, tripping over his own garden hose in the process. Ironically, because while his bedroom was lit up like a supernova, his front lawn was in the shadow of his own house. "Mind the hose, Richard," I called out helpfully. I checked the carbon rod feed. The arc was stable. The generator temperature was holding. "Sparky," I said to the empty chair where my electrician had been. He was now hiding behind the shed, filming the whole thing on his phone. "We are operational." 10 minutes later, the blue lights arrived. The arrival of the police was spectacular. 3 cruisers came tearing into the neighborhood, sirens wailing. But as they turned onto Elm Street, the sirens abruptly cut off. Why? Because the officers were too busy staring. The visual of the scene was striking. You had the pitch-black void of the surrounding neighborhood, and then you had a single, solid cylinder of blue-white light cutting through the atmosphere, terminating on the upper floor of a beige colonial house that looked like it was being interrogated by God. The cruisers rolled to a stop in front of my house. The blue and red strobe lights of the police cars looked pathetic compared to the gigawatt dominance of the Searchlight. It was like holding a candle next to a volcano. Officer Miller stepped out of the lead car. He adjusted his belt. He adjusted his hat. He looked at the Searchlight. He looked at Richard's house. He looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked impressed. Richard came running out of his house again, this time wearing sunglasses. At night. "Officer! Arrest him!" Richard screamed, pointing at me. "He's attacking me! It's assault! Assault with a deadly lamp!" Officer Miller walked up my driveway. 2 other officers followed, hands resting near their holsters, but their body language was loose. They were trying not to smile. "Evening, Jack," Miller shouted over the generator. I stood up and saluted. "Evening, Officer Miller. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We got a few calls," Miller said, shouting to be heard. Reports of an alien invasion, a plane crash, and the sun exploding. Also, Richard here says you're trying to cook him alive." "Just illuminating the neighborhood, sir," I said, innocent. "Since the streetlights are broken, I felt it was my civic duty to provide backup lighting, for safety." Miller walked over to the Searchlight. He felt the heat radiating off it from 10 feet away. "Jack, this is excessive." "Is it illegal?" I asked. Miller paused. He looked at Richard, who was practically vibrating with rage. "It's a nuisance," Richard yelled. "It violates the noise ordinance. It violates the lighting ordinance. It violates the Geneva Convention." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a binder. I had prepared for this. "Actually, officer," I said, handing him the binder. "Tab 1, the generator. It's a Hercules 15 kW. It runs at exactly 84 decibels at 20 feet. The city ordinance for daytime noise is 90 decibels. For nighttime, it's 75. However," I flipped the page. "There is an exemption for emergency power generation and safety equipment. Given the documented hazard of the unlit streets, including the hospitalization of Mrs. Higgins, this classifies as emergency safety lighting. Miller looked at the document. He looked at his rookie partner. He's got a point. It is dark as hell out here. Tab 2, I continued. The light itself. The HOA bylaws restrict permanent fixtures attached to the home. This is on a trailer. It is mobile. It is not attached. Furthermore, it is a 1942 historical artifact. Under the Historical Preservation Act of the county, temporary displays of military history are protected speech. "He's blinding me!" Richard shrieked. "Look at my window!" Miller looked at the window. "Jack, can you dim it?" "It's a carbon arc, officer. It doesn't dim. It's either off or wrath of God. But I can adjust the aim." "Please do," Miller said. I grabbed the traverse wheel and cranked it 2 degrees to the left. The beam slid off Richard's window and hit the brick, chimney instead. The glare was still intense, but Richard was no longer being X-rayed. "Better?" I asked. "My chimney is smoking," Richard yelled. "It's just drying out the moss, Richard. You should thank me. Moss destroys masonry." Miller sighed. He turned to Richard. "Sir, look. Technically, he's not breaking a criminal law. He's on his property. The noise is borderline but within the emergency variance if he claims it's for safety. This is a civil matter, an HOA matter." "I am the HOA," Richard sputtered. "I want that thing towed." "I can't tow a vehicle from private property without a court order," Miller said. "And frankly, sir, fixing the streetlights would probably resolve this, wouldn't it?" Richard went purple. "This is extortion!" "This is neighborhood watch," I corrected. Miller turned back to me. "Jack, do me a favor. Shut it down by 11 p.m. People need to sleep." 10:59 p.m., officer. You have my word." Miller tipped his cap. "Have a good night. Gentlemen." As the cops walked back to their cars, I heard the rookie whisper to Miller, "That is the coolest thing I have ever seen." "Don't encourage him," Miller whispered back, though he was grinning. They drove away. I looked at Richard. He stood alone on the sidewalk, bathed in the ambient glow of the 800 million candle power beam hitting his chimney. He looked defeated. He looked small. 10:59, Richard, I called out. "That gives you an hour and a half to enjoy the view." Richard didn't say a word. He turned around, walked into his house, and slammed the door. A moment later, I saw him crawling across his living room floor on his hands and knees to close the blackout curtains. The curtains didn't help. The light punched right through them, turning them into glowing rectangles of white fabric. I sat back down. The beer tasted like victory. The siege lasted 3 days. Night 1 was shock and awe. Night 2 was psychological warfare. Richard tried to be clever. He parked his SUV in his driveway to block the beam. The beam hit the windshield, reflected off the glass, and illuminated his entire dining room like a discotheque. He had to move the car after 10 minutes because the dashboard started to smell like melting plastic. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had turned into a carnival. People were coming out with lawn chairs. Mrs. Gable brought me a casserole. "Thank you, Jack," she said, patting my arm. "I can finally see to walk Fifi, and the heat from that thing is great for my arthritis." "Happy to serve, Mrs. Gable." Kids were making shadow puppets on Richard's house. Giant rabbits and birds danced across his siding, tormenting him. It was beautiful. Night 3 was the breaking point. I fired up the generator at 8:45 p.m., just as the sun went down. The familiar roar of the Hercules engine echoed through the subdivision. By now it was a comforting sound to the neighbors, the sound of justice. I struck the arc. The beam lashed out, but before I could even settle into my chair, my phone rang. It was Richard. "Turn it off," he said. His voice sounded raspy, tired. "Good evening, Mr. President," I said cheerfully. "To what do I owe the honor?" "I can't sleep, Jack. I haven't slept in 48 hours. My wife is staying at her sister's. The cat is traumatized. The siding on the east wall is warping." "Sounds like you have some maintenance issues, Richard. Maybe you should commission a study." "I surrender," he said. "What do you want?" "I want the streetlights fixed. All of them. Tonight." "I can't fix them tonight. I need to call the contractor." "Then you better call him now. Because I have a lot of carbon rods, Richard. I bought a crate of 50. I can keep this up until Christmas. Imagine this light reflecting off the snow. It'll be majestic." There was a long silence. Then a sigh that sounded like a tire losing air. "I'm calling the electric company emergency line. They charge triple for after hours." "Budgetary recalibration," I reminded him. "Use the pool tile money." Fine. Just, please, turn it off." "I'll dim it when I see the truck," I said. "I'll turn it off when the streetlights turn on." I hung up. 2 hours later, a massive bucket truck from the city utility rolled onto Elm Street. The crew looked confused. They saw my searchlight beaming into the sky. I had graciously aimed it at the clouds while we waited, creating a Batman signal that drew people from 3 towns over. Richard was out on the curb, in his robe, frantically waving at the utility guys. He was pointing at the light posts, handing them credit cards, signing papers. He looked like a man trying to pay a ransom. The crew got to work. It turned out it wasn't a $50,000 rewiring job. It was a blown fuse in the main junction box and 3 bad photo sensors. At 11:15 p.m., it happened. Flicker. Buzz. The streetlight in front of Mrs. Higgins' house hummed to life. A beautiful, soft, amber glow. Then the one in front of the Hendersons. Then the one in front of mine. One by one, the 12 streetlights of Elm and Oak stuttered and shined. The street was illuminated. Not by the aggressive, blinded by science glare of 1942, but by the warm, civilized glow of municipal infrastructure. The neighbors cheered. Actual applause broke out. Mrs. Gable banged a wooden spoon on a pot. I stood up. I walked over to the searchlight. "Good work, General," I whispered to the machine. I cut the fuel to the generator. The roar sputtered, coughed, and died. The silence that rushed back into the neighborhood was heavy and sweet. I cranked the wheel, breaking the arc. The blinding white beam vanished, leaving purple spots dancing in everyone's vision. Richard walked over. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 days. He stood at the end of my driveway, looking at the dark, silent hulk of the searchlight. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. "Long as the lights stay on, Richard," I said. "As long as the lights stay on." "You're a maniac, Jack." "I'm a logistics expert," I corrected. "And I believe in the proper allocation of resources. You allocated the darkness. I allocated the light." He shook his head and walked back to his house. For the first time in months, he walked under a working streetlight. The next week, there was a special election. Richard decided to pursue other interests, i.e., his wife threatened to leave him if he didn't quit the board. I didn't run for president. I'm not a politician. But I did keep the searchlight. It sits in my backyard now, on its concrete pad, covered by a custom canvas tarp. I planted some rose bushes around it, so it blends in. But everyone knows it's there. It's the nuclear option. The silent guardian. Every now and then, when the HOA starts talking about banning pickup trucks or measuring grass height with a ruler, I go out to the backyard. I take off the tarp. I start cleaning the lens, and amazingly, the issue just resolves itself, because nobody wants to stare into the sun, especially when the sun is parked in Jack Miller's backyard.